Well, it's the greatest pleasure to be speaking to Sir John Rutter just about a month before his 80th birthday. And Sir John, all your friends, supporters, fans in the Vaughan Williams Society and music lovers around the world send you their greetings. Have a wonderful, wonderful birthday next month.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to it, though not necessarily looking forward to the actual figure, but I will have a modest celebration here at home.
There you go. So look, I think we should start with you at Highgate School, which was a very musical school. Other musicians like Howard Shelley and John Taverner were there. You had a big go-ahead music master, I seem to remember, and a very good choir. And I'm just guessing that Vaughan Williams would have come into your life, certainly in a choral sense, really, while you were at school. Would that be right?
Yes, absolutely right. Through the hymns in Songs of Praise, which were used for morning assembly, which Vaughan Williams edited with Percy Dearmer. A little later through the English hymnal, to which he contributed, and of course through the folk song arrangements. And I always thought of Vaughan Williams, and in a way I still do, a little bit like the loaf of bread in the larder or the pint of milk on the doorstep. You take them for granted, but somehow they're essential to life. And it just seemed absolutely natural that Vaughan Williams was there as part of my musical experience. I enjoyed the stomping tune to For All the Saints Who From Their Labours Rest, and the rather more subtle one, perhaps, for Come Down, O Love Divine. And I think I learned various things, absorbed them really, just from having Vaughan Williams as part of my musical landscape. One is that there's no reason music shouldn't have a tune, that he was melodically inspired. And one of the few 20th century concert composers who really had a strong melodic gift. It was no longer obligatory, really, for the first generation of 20th century composers, from Debussy onwards, you might say. You don't remember them for their tunes, you remember them for all sorts of other wonderful qualities that they brought to their music. And so I think that was something that imprinted itself upon me. And I think it also became clear that he felt there was no shame in writing for amateurs and for children and for students. And of course, that's something which rather went out of fashion in the 20th century. But I think Vaughan Williams saw professional life as a continuum between the highly skilled professionals at the apex and the broad base of amateurs and students that support it. And he wrote equally well for both. And I think that was a gift that was probably rather unusual. He and Holst shared that same belief. It was almost a social thing, you might say, that was in tune with his radical beliefs about society. That we were, in a sense, all one. And he had probably a rather lopsided vision of it because he saw people like himself from highly educated, sophisticated families related to the Darwins and the Wedgwoods and all of that. He saw them as being sort of somewhere at the apex, let's say, and what he dreamed of as a host of happy peasants in their tidy cottages in the country singing ancient folk songs, somewhere propping all of that up. And he never really had much time for urban folk song, and he never had much time, as far as I know, for what you might call commercial music hall music, which of course reached probably rather more people from the labouring classes than did the beautiful rural folk songs that were part of his being.
Yeah. Well, so you obviously were born in 1945, if my arithmetic is correct. Of course it is. So you know, there were 13 years in which Vaughan Williams was alive at the start of your life. I mean, were you aware of him as a living presence in any sort of way?
Only in that I think I attended the premiere of the Ninth Symphony in the Royal Festival Hall, then very new, and I saw an aged gentleman dressed in tweed taking a bow at the end of it. I can't remember why I was taken to that concert, and I probably didn't make terribly much of the Ninth Symphony at the time, but I do remember his death and his funeral because it was a national event. In a way that says something about the cultural shift that has taken place since then, because it was, I believe, broadcast, his funeral, that is, from Westminster Abbey by the BBC, and it was something almost like the Winston Churchill of music dying. And I don't think the same kind of honour and attention would be given to any classical composer of today. And I think that says something about the cultural shift that has taken place. But at the same time, because he was such a universal figure who more or less had a go at almost any musical genre that was going. I mean, he wrote operas, he wrote symphonies, he wrote chamber music, he wrote loads of choral music, he wrote songs. There was nothing he didn't have a go at. And I'm not sure that there are any composers of a younger generation who have attempted or felt that they need to be as universal as all that. Of course, we did always have specialist composers, the Chopin with piano music and Verdi with opera, but Vaughan Williams believed he should straddle all the different kinds of music, professional and amateur, and that was important. And I think something I absorbed in my early years just from singing the folk song arrangements and the hymns and being aware of the five mystical songs, for example, was that he had awfully good taste in poetry. His literary taste was very well developed. And I think it was a message that I took on board. Look carefully for your words, because in the English language, we have an enormous wealth of wonderful poetry, and I would include the Bible and the prayer book and all of that, which we can tap into. He did write music with Latin texts from time to time, but I think his deepest love when it came to words was poetry in the English language. And of course, Benjamin Britten inherited that because he also had excellent literary taste.
Yeah.
And I think that the joining together of words and music in that way is a very English thing. And that was one of the things that made him a great composer, I think, that he knew how to choose great words.
Yeah. And of course, he shared the love of literature with both of his wives. I think I'm right in saying you surely did meet Ursula, his second wife, on occasion. I can think of an occasion, there probably were more, but you did know her.
Yes, I did. When there was a memorial for one of the senior people at Oxford University Press, who of course was his publisher for many years, I did meet her and was introduced to her. I think in the flesh, that was probably about it. There might have been one or two other publishers' occasions where she would always gallantly show up if she could. And I remember that wonderful television documentary, O Thou Transcendent, which was made very shortly before her death, where, disabled as she was in a sense by, I think it was probably one of a series of strokes, she nevertheless was able to articulate her feelings about him and his work, because clearly they made a deep, deep impression on her.
Yeah. Okay. Writing the choirs meant a great deal to him. That's what you've expressed very cogently. Does he write well for choirs? Does he write well for the voice, would you say?
Absolutely. He always did. And that had something to do with his love of folk song. But let's remember that the five mystical songs from 1906, I think they were thereabouts, really predated his close interest in folk song. And he already had then an inbuilt sense of vocal line. And Lyndon Lee, which was, of course, wasn't it his chief royalty earner in some of his early years? That was an early effort. But of course, it's sublimely melodic and absolutely flows off the tonsils. And it's what became very beloved because it is so easy and gratifying to sing. I think he had an ease with the human voice that I'm not sure William Walton quite had. I always had a suspicion that Walton, for all that he was a chorister at Christ Church, and Vaughan Williams was never a cathedral chorister, actually, was he? Walton was more at ease writing for instruments than he was with voices, where there was a certain angularity which makes him quite hard to pull off. That's to say, Walton. Now, Britain had a wonderful feeling for the voice, of course. It is something you think of as being part of every English composer's toolkit. And there's no doubt that Vaughan Williams had it. A gift of melody has got a lot to do with being able to write well for the voice. And the thing that's so astonishing is that he never stopped exploring. One of my favourite choral works by Vaughan Williams is very small scale and a very late work. It's the 3 Shakespeare songs for unaccompanied choir, which, bless me, they've got note clusters in the first of those 3 movements. Well, you associate those with ligeti, but Vaughan Williams was doing it in 1950, 51, was it? And I believe it was written for the Cornell Glee Club. And I think we have reports to the effect that they struggled with them because the demands that he was making were absolutely reasonable and vocal, but just not like anything that they had probably sung before. And so he was taking as it were, a look into the future, rather in the same way that Haydn was in writing the representation of chaos at the beginning of the creation, the music that seems to point forward to something long after the composer's own time. And I wonder what he might have done if he had followed up that particular trail, because in the 1950s, Hodier, for example, mostly retreads familiar ground vocally. It is very well written, but it returns to some of his great loves of chorales and hymnody and all of that, while at the same time there's a certain freedom that I don't associate with his earlier choral work. Yeah. So I think the choral medium was obviously very important to him, and it embraced both really the fairly professional realm. I mean, well, very professional realm if you think of the Serenade to Music, which has become an honorary choral work, even though, of course, it was for 16 solo voices. That's one of my absolute favourite Vaughan Williams works because it seems to capture, with Shakespeare's poetry, something just sublime that hangs in space. Yeah. And is forever there and forever radiant and transparent and lovely. And we do actually have a recording, don't we, of the original 16 voices. Yeah. And of course, his understanding of each individual voice was so complete that when you hear it sung by the voices for whom it was written, you realize just how well it was suited to them. Yeah. And really, you can't recapture that now unless you can find 16 soloists, all of very similar character.
That's right. Well, of course, Rachmaninoff was playing in the Henry Wood celebration concert when the Serenade to Music was first performed, and it is said that he let a tear or two drop from his eye at the sound of the Serenade to Music. He was deeply moved by it, apparently.
I'm not surprised.
There you are. Absolutely so. Such radiance. You've got the Fourth Symphony, for example, that angularity and harshness, and suddenly you have this radiance, which, of course, people say it's got something to do with having met Ursula. Who can really say? We just don't know. But look, you've mentioned there the 3 Shakespeare songs, which you've recorded with the Cambridge Singers on your own label, Collegium. You've done a number of Vaughan Williams works with the Cambridge Singers, but you've obviously been selective. And I wonder if you could just talk us through some of the things that you have recorded and why you chose them and not others.
Well, I recorded a motet he wrote, I think it may have been for Westminster Cathedral Choir, Ovos Omnes. which I think is extraordinary. And again, not quite like anything else he wrote, drawing inspiration from what we're told was the extraordinary excellence of that choir. And of course, Westminster Cathedral Choir were not the original dedicatees of the Mass in G minor, but nevertheless, they would have been ideal exponents of that music in that acoustic. I haven't recorded as much Vaughan Williams as I would have liked to, largely because really he's never fallen into neglect in terms of the performances and recordings that is received. I think there's a case to be made probably for concentrating on music that has been passed over for one reason or another. I made the first recording, for example, of Poulenc's choral music, including the Gloria, but the Lenten motets, the Christmas motets, and various other pieces that really were not well known at the time. And Vaughan Williams, I've always felt, perhaps like that loaf of bread in the larder, I've taken him for granted. I feel he's always there, always with us. I think there's no doubt that critically he went through a bit of a post-mortem trough. And that had something to do with that, I think, rather unfair and unjust jibe. Was it Constant Lambert who talked about his music and that of others of his contemporaries as cowpat music? Well, I think he was capable of meandering because, like any prolific composer, and of course he was not only a hard-working composer, but a very long-lived one, active right up till the day before he died. And you're bound to find that some works just somehow succeed better than others do. I've done the Benedicite, for example, in concert in New York. And do you know, I was awfully naughty because I made some cuts. And I just felt that the concision that those cuts gave it made it work better. I don't always feel by any means that he went on too long, because he was capable of creating very tightly wrought structures. But that was one of the works where I thought he did go on a bit. And you can say also, I suppose, that Pilgrim's Progress, which he would have seen as in some ways a culmination of his life's work. Perhaps that is a little too long from beginning to end. In the rather unkind glare of the opera house spotlight, where you want the drama to move forward from moment to moment, even if it's on a leisurely time scale, he didn't quite get that. I would love to hear some of the other Vaughan Williams operas, like The Poison Kiss, for example. How good are they, I wonder? I did hear a concert performance of his first one, Hugh the Drover, which has got some delightful stuff in it. And Sir John in Love, I remember singing at school,
Really?
at Windsor Forest, the cantata that he derived from it. And somehow it had that quality which I've always thought is worth aiming for, that somehow the music seemed to have always been there. He just discovered it. And he wasn't the composer who said that, well, I find music that's in the air and I just gather it in. But I think he did have a sense of timelessness, which does transcend generations and sort of make it seem almost like the five mystical songs could have been written last week. There is something like, or the Cloud-Capped Towers, the middle of the three Shakespeare songs. Somehow you can't nail that down in any one time or place. It seems to me to be music for all time.
Absolutely. Well, you mentioned Pilgrim's Progress there, John. Of course, that takes us into the Fifth Symphony, which is very much linked to the Pilgrim's Progress music. And indeed, the Fifth Symphony you have conducted at least once before, and you're performing it in St. Paul's Cathedral on November the 5th, a celebration of your birthday. This symphony means something particular to you?
Yes, it's something that goes right back to my years at school. We had a school record library, and in it were some 1950s recordings of Adrian Boult conducting Vaughan Williams. Now, he was not the only good early exponent of Vaughan Williams, but he was one of his consistent champions. And I remember I discovered the Fifth Symphony, and somehow it felt like I'd always known it. Or put it another way, it had become part of me. And it was a piece of music I knew I would return to. And I must have been about 16 at the time. Somehow it spoke to me. It's deceptive because it appears to be rather simple on the surface. Quite a lot of it is meditative. And of course, what I didn't know is that it was written at the height of World War II. Where, in a sense, Vaughan Williams had written his war symphony before the war, the Fourth Symphony. It was sort of prophetic of all the horrors which were to follow within less than a decade. But the Fifth Symphony, written while it was actually going on, somehow symbolized the hope of what he saw as Jerusalem, the holy city, a vision of peace, which lay beyond it. And as an idealist, which he was, politically and socially, I think he looked towards a realm of peace and serenity, where violence would be no more. And it is a wonderful work. It's interesting because you think of it as being a major work and a substantial one. It's actually quite concise. The Fifth Symphony is no more than 35 minutes in length. And I always did hope that one day I'd conduct it. And it must have been about 12 years ago that I was asked by the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra to choose a second half work that I could do in the concert that we customarily give in Remembrance Tide in St. Paul's Cathedral. And I thought, well, somehow this symphony is associated in my mind with the iconic image of St. Paul's Cathedral with the flames all around it in the Blitz, and with Vaughan Williams's response as an artist to that. Now, he'd borne arms in the First World War, though he stood up very bravely for Michael Tippett, for example, who was not going to bear arms in war. And he said, well, I disagree, but I absolutely respect that point of view. So I think he had a rather bifocal attitude towards war and conflict, that he knew all about it at first hand. And I think he ardently longed for peace. And the thing is, that symphony seems to express it. And my wish to conduct it again in this birthday celebration concert was in part sparked off by a performance conducted by Simon Rattle during the period of the pandemic, when concert life was barely happening. And there it was. I actually caught it on television. And I thought, hang on a minute, this is Vaughan Williams 5, conducted by Simon Rattle. Vaughan Williams is absolutely not a composer I would associate him with. And of course, is important enough that nobody tells him what to conduct. I mean, it must have been his choice. But when the chips were down and we were in the grip of a global emergency, nobody really knowing when it was going to end or how it was going to end, Vaughan Williams was who he turned to. Yeah. That says something.
Yeah, I imagine somewhere in the back of your mind, or perhaps near the front of your mind, John, you were thinking how wonderful that symphony will sound in the spaces of St. Paul's Cathedral. I can just hear it now. That must have been something that influenced you.
Yes, he had a great sense of space. In so much of his music, you can't or shouldn't perform it in a dry studio acoustic. That he had a wonderful sense of soaring architecture, and that feeling of awe and reverence that we perhaps feel in a rather non-specifically spiritual way when we enter a cathedral through the west door, is something that I think he captured just perfectly. And although I imagine the Fifth Symphony was premiered in a concert hall, I think in a way it belongs in the cathedral of the imagination. It's
Yeah.
not in an actual cathedral. And of course, he's not always given credit for the excellence of his orchestral writing as such. And he, in his early years, showed, I think, very convincingly in the London Symphony, for example, that he had every bit as colourful an ear for the instruments of the orchestra as did the more obvious Ravel, from whom he took, I don't quite what form his lessons in Paris took, but he wanted to take lessons from Ravel, which shows, I think, that he had something he felt he could learn from that great master of the orchestra. And he pared down his scoring in later years to something that could be, in this particular work, rather economical. He only uses two horns, he uses timpani, but there's no percussion. He doesn't need it. The music somehow is boiled down to actually the sounds that he heard in his head, the multi-divided strings in the Romancer movement with the cor anglais solo sound absolutely sublime.
Well, yes, well, John, you're talking there about distilling things down to an essence, and that would certainly also apply to the Lark Ascending, which you've also conducted in the past, a work that means something very special to you, I think.
Yes, it does. It's a unique work. How would you describe it? A mini concerto, a rhapsody, a fantasia, a tone poem? I'm not sure. It's all of those things, and yet none of them. It stands alone. And he wrote it for an orchestral lineup, which was actually rather unusual. Just a handful of woodwind with the strings and a lone triangle who just contributes one or two notes there in the middle, and woe betide any player who's unfortunate enough to miss the cue. But it's a work that has haunted everyone's imagination, really, because it exists in the realm where music and poetry meet. And I think that's a rather English thing because of this love of poetry and of words in general. I think you can divide composers into novelists and poets. And you might say Beethoven was generally a novelist. He sort of wrote War and Peace in music, if you like to look at it that way. And then there are poets, and you would say Chopin was a poet, for example. Herbert Howells, who Vaughan Williams, of course, supported very generously, was one of music's poets. But Vaughan Williams was both a novelist and a poet, because he was capable of large-scale structures that he could pull off very convincingly, even in his first symphony. I mean, that's a pretty vast work. I mean, not far short of Mahler in its extent. But at the same time, he could write the Lark Ascending, which was just a pure distilled piece of poetry where there isn't a single instrument in the orchestra that isn't needed. Just a handful of woodwind, a couple of horns, and somehow the soloist weaves magic around them. It is an extraordinary work. And I think there's probably, well, you yourself, Andrew, have told the story of its genesis. But there is a mystery at the heart of it because we still don't really know quite why he wrote that work that he did, even assuming that we know that he wanted to write something for Murray Hall, the first soloist. Why did it take that form, we wonder?
Yeah. Well, one of the wonderful things about the Lark Ascending that's happened in my lifetime is seeing it move. We all were conquered by Hugh Bean's recording, of course, absolutely magical recording. And even though it had been performed many times by non-British violinists, indeed around the world, what's happened since that wonderful Hugh Bean recording is there's been recorded by people from, I think I counted up about 20 different nationalities. It really is a work that transcends national boundaries. It's not simply a quintessentially British work. It really does reach out.
Well, it does in the sense that the violin has actually got a voice of its own, which can't help but speak across national boundaries. It's interesting that in the Classic FM Hall of Fame, before the Lark Ascending started to top the poll, it was the Bruch Violin Concerto. Again, a solo violin. There's something about the violin which just speaks out. And I think it is interesting that, as you say, it's now reached sort of all these different countries who've been able to tune in to something that is terribly British. I suppose you would say that Smetana's quintessentially Czech in a way, but we can all enjoy Voltova, and so I think you can imagine anything you like when you listen to the Lark Ascending. I think an awful lot of people would imagine an English summer landscape, and whether they come from here or from somewhere where there are no hills and valleys, perhaps from Antarctica or from the plains of South America. Nevertheless, I think it does speak. And that's one of the things about him. Vaughan Williams probably was not a political nationalist, but he did believe in national music, and he wrote an essay, indeed, about it, saying that it's, we should aim for something that's original and quintessentially our own, rather than, I think he called it, collecting the offscourings of the classics. And it wasn't that, of course, he was against music from, well, it would have been mainly German music that he grew up with, I suppose, as the dominant cultural influence in Britain. But I think he had a case to make about how we were in danger of forgetting our own national heritage. The middle section of the Lark Ascending does have what I think is an invented quasi-folk song. And it isn't, as far as I know, a real one, but it could be one. And that's something inherited, as a matter of fact, by Richard Rodney Bennett when he wrote the music for Far From the Madding Crowd, based on the Thomas Hardy novel in the 1960s, that the opening theme, which you see over a shimmering landscape of the Dorset Hills, sounds like a folk song. But I asked Richard Bennett about it, and he said, I made it up.
Absolutely. Well, look, there's so much more inside your head, John, that I want to explore it merely in the Vaughan Williams realm. And I'm sorry we actually have to stop there. We could go on all night. We really, really could. Look, we wish you all the best for your birthday again. We wish you all the best for that St. Paul's Cathedral concert on November the 5th. I'm sorry to say that all seats have been sold already and had been sold some considerable time. But equally wish you all the best for your ongoing career. You're still composing. You had to work at the proms this year. You're still traveling around the world, taking workshops and conducting and all the rest. We wish you all the very, very best with that. And keep going, sir.
I intend to.